Thank you, Mr. President. Sadly, I have to do a speech that I promised I would do every week until we find justice for someone who's been in a Turkish prison now for a number of days. This is Pastor Brunson. He's a Presbyterian minister from Black Mountain. He's been in Turkey for about 20 years doing missionary work in a small church I'll describe briefly later. But on October 4th, 2016, he was swept up in President Erdogan regime's reaction to an unlawful coup, a coup that I disagree with. I believe in a peaceful transition of power, and I do believe that people that were responsible for it should be subject to Turkish laws. But the roundup of people that President Erdogan, he cast a very wide net. It went so far beyond any reasonable expectation of people who could have been involved in the coup attempt. But on October 4th, 2016, a Presbyterian minister from Black Mountain, North Carolina, same church that Billy Graham was a part of, found himself arrested for potential terrorist and plotting the coup attempt charges. He's in a Turkish prison. He's been in that prison now for 593 days. 593 days for almost 17 months without charges. Held in a prison cell designed for 8 people that had 21 people in it. Not really allowed to speak with his family. In fact, the only family he's seen over the last 593 days have been his wife, because they've been afraid to let his children come in the country for fear that they would not be allowed to leave. And nor will Noreen, his wife, leave the country for fear that she won't be able to come back. She's his only connection to his family. 593 days. Now, I want to go back and tell you what really underlines why they think this Presbyterian minister is a part of the coup attempt or terrorist organizations, because they believe that religions in the United States are somehow joined together in this intelligence gathering network so that they can go and, instead of doing missionary work, they can go into these countries and infiltrate their systems and then force coups or support or provide aid to people who would commit a terrorist act against the Turkish homeland. Something that I would something that I would say that anybody that did that should be subject to Turkish law. But they believe that Pastor Brunson, a pastor of a church in Izmir, for many years when he was doing missionary work, he didn't even have a church. They finally were able to get the resources together. They have about 50 members of this. This is a 50-member congregation in a church in Izmir, which is one of the more populous cities in Turkey. This is the church. It's a very small church that in a packed day on a Sunday, you may be able to fit 120 people in it. They open the doors so that the people walking down the street can see what they're talking about. They open the windows. They invite anybody in. Well, part of the case is that people have entered that church that they believe are Kurdish, and because they were Kurdish, they must be associated with the PKK, and if they're associated with the PKK, then clearly they were involved in terrorist attempts against Turkey. This church also was used in evidence, this center picture here. It's a small room upstairs in this very small church. One of the secret witnesses, and there have been over a dozen secret witnesses, in a Turkish prison, he doesn't have a trial jury. He has 3 judges, and he has a prosecutor who's elevated to effectively another judge that he's testifying before. One of the secret witnesses said that he clearly is guilty of nefarious activities because one night he saw a window open in this church for about 4 hours. That was the evidence submitted. There's a problem with that. Number one, in our country, generally speaking, having a light on doesn't necessarily go directly to a prosecution for terrorism, conspiracy to commit terrorism. There's another problem with this allegation. This room doesn't have a window. There's no possible way somebody could have seen the light. Even if you would argue that seeing a light could somehow be linked to terrorist activity, you can't even see it. Now, to make matters worse, after more than a dozen secret witnesses came on, many of them in Turkish prisons themselves for the prosecution, the defense asked that they had 10 witnesses who would testify on his behalf. The judges said they would not be allowed to testify because they're suspects. They haven't been charged with anything necessarily. They may not even be incarcerated, but they're suspects. and therefore he has no opportunity whatsoever to defend himself. So I'm about to go back and do a final vote on the National Defense Authorization Act. We have got to get President Erdogan's attention. And in a bill that we're going to have before this floor over the next couple of weeks, I believe we're going to send a very clear message to the President and to the people of Turkey to treat our people fairly. Treat a nation that's prepared to send American men and women to Turkey to fight and die for their freedom. Treat us with respect. And if they don't, then we're going to have to continue to up the temperature until justice is done for Pastor Brunson and others in Turkish prisons. Mr. President, I yield the floor.